When we talk about startups, when we talk about scaling up, when we talk about the internet and the fourth industrial revolution, we always talk about the trends to follow. The trends and data, two key words that our next speaker is going to brief us about. He's the CEO and founder of Magnet, Philippe Bahoshi. The floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Philippe Bahoshi and I'm the founder of Magnet. And at this Euromed Scale-Up Day, I've been asked to talk about how venture data is driving startup ecosystems across the whole of the region. Just to put a bit of context, Magnet is the leading startup data platform for what we're calling emerging venture markets. We aggregate information on 16,000 startups from across the ecosystem and all the investments that have been taking place in that space. Using that data, we're able to do analysis and trends because stakeholders across the whole of the region use this information, whether it be for decision-making, identifying competitors, policies, or benchmarking, to be able to make and drive innovation within those ecosystems. We have now tracked $5.5 billion worth of investment in the MENA region. That's a huge amount when you consider where we were and where we've got to. In terms of evolution, the ecosystem here in MENA has continued to grow. And I'll come on to discuss COVID a little bit later on. If you see the graph, in this particular case, charting 2015 to 2020 year to date, and this is for the Q3 numbers, you basically see three numbers. The red amount, which is disclosed funding, either from investors, startups on the platform, or through third-party sources. A gray amount for undisclosed proxies, and these black amounts, which we call mega deals. Now, when you remove those mega deals, historically big companies like Souk and Kareem that can somewhat skew the underlying ecosystem, you can see, along with the total number of deals, that there is an acceleration of venture investments across the whole of the region. And as we know, governments focus on entrepreneurship in a way of diversifying economies, it's important to provide this data and information for them to see the long-term importance of this as an industry. But let's put things into context. How does the MENA region compare to the rest of the world? Well, interestingly, MENA, when we look at 2019's figures, compared to the Netherlands in terms of the total amount of investment that was put into venture as an asset class. So you can't really, although it's not fair to compare to the US, even Europe or Southeast Asia as a geography. And therefore, there's still a long way to go. And when we're making those decisions, what are the key factors that need to be considered? The ecosystem is an evolving process. And when we look at that, it's important to understand a couple of things. Where is the investment going in terms of stage? Which countries is this investment going into? And what kind of industries are investors interested in? So at a high level, this chart, which takes all investments that have taken place from 2015 to 2020 and plotted it by stage of investment. Here you can actually see elements of a maturing ecosystem. You see on average 87 to 88% of all investments are going at early stage, which isn't completely uncommon. But while the percentages for Series A, Series B, and later stage remain relatively constant in the last couple of years, you'll see at the top the absolute number of deals that are taking place have continued to grow, except for 2020, which we're only capturing Q3 year to date. In terms of geography, you also start seeing how different things have been changing. If you took this chart probably 4 or 5 years ago in 2015, you would have seen that countries like Lebanon and Jordan, which were early adopters of technology, would have ranked much higher than others. Whereas now you're seeing the three ecosystems in the region, the three dominant ecosystems, becoming the UAE, which has probably got the most developed infrastructure in terms of headquarters and startups, seeing the lion's share or the most amount of investments with 26 year to date. Egypt, which has the largest population and continues to strive in terms of innovation. And Saudi Arabia, which was actually the quickest growing year over year in terms of the number of deals. At the same time, when you look at the startups that have received the most investment by headquarter, the UAE still receives the lion's share of investments. And therefore, when governments are trying to understand where best to make policies to drive innovation, where corporates are trying to identify companies or to find advertising targets. These are some of the trends that they look at when trying to understand what's happening here in the region. And interestingly, especially this year, you have seen the key industries of e-commerce, fintech, food and beverage, healthcare, all industries that have seen increased demand given the current COVID environment, have startups that have received the most investment in terms of asset class. And when you look at it by amount of investment, they're very similar, with e-commerce taking 26%, food and beverage at 20%, and fintech at 14%. Again, these are just indicators of the appetite of investors in particular industries across the whole of the region. What was the COVID effect? Again, many people have come to us to try and understand and quantify what has happened as a result of COVID-19. And again, it's the data that can help decision makers and policymakers. What you actually saw was that H1 2020 was a record year for the amount of investment. Now, we all know that in the venture space, it tends to take 9 to 12, if not longer, months for a deal to close. And therefore, you can probably anticipate that any deals that took place in Q1 of this year, if not Q2, were probably already deals in the making that started back in 2019. What we have seen, though, in Q3, and that's where you see the line at the top, is the lowest quarter, a number of transactions dating back all the way to early 2018. And therefore, you are seeing that delayed effect of COVID, whereby investment decisions that may have started or in the beginnings back in April or May have probably not necessarily been as accelerated as the previous quarters. And where historically the summer months have continued to be slow months for the region, this was much more acute this year, with investments really tailing off into September. But one of the things that I said at the beginning of this year, that this would be a record year for the number of exits. Last year was already a record year where you see mergers and acquisitions taking place either horizontally, where companies across different geographies with similar products are able to combine to become a stronger force. Vertically, whereby companies try to buy downstream to become a more holistic proposition. Corporate venture capital continuing to be a key catalyst to exits. And international acquirers, the likes of your Kareem's acquisition from Uber and Souk's acquisition by Amazon. But thus far in 2020, that hasn't necessarily been the case, with some saying that lower valuations have made it less appealing for companies to be sold out. And you also saw this change in the total deal sizes. So for instance, if you look at the top 5 deals of this year, all of which took place pretty much, or 4 out of the 5 in the earlier part of this year, were ranging from $35 million to $150 million. Whereas when you look at Q3 specifically, the range was $30.5 million to $20 million, none of which make it into the top 5 deals of the year. And therefore you are seeing slightly smaller rounds, much smaller rounds later in the year than you did see earlier in the year. The truth of the matter is we're continuing to track this information and data to year end to really see how 2020 plays out, and also Q1 2021 as we come out of hopefully the COVID era, or a new norm of the COVID era influencing the startup venture space. One thing we did see, and again influenced by some of the earlier deals this year, is higher deal rounds at both early stage, Series A and Series B, as founders gain confidence and understanding of the startup and venture space. Also learning from the information transparency that's provided, as we've seen more investors entering this space than ever before.